Right, to talk a little bit more about the Ukraine-Russia crisis, we're joined now by our correspondent in Washington, Nick Harper, who talks to us about the latest from the American capital. So, Nick, it's been a flurry of diplomatic events. Perhaps let's just first start with the latest from the U.S. in terms of President Joe Biden, his stance. I know he continues to talk very tough about sanctions, but I believe the SWIFT system, breaking off Russia's financial access to global markets, is still a stickler point.
Well, yeah, it certainly is. Let's talk about those sanctions first. We've seen 4 days running of the US imposing a whole variety of different sanctions, sanctioning different banks, sanctioning state-owned companies, sanctioning the Russian elite. But there is that sticking point that some people, critics out there, think that the US and European allies are not going far enough when it comes to sanctions. For example, they are not sanctioning the Russian leader himself, Vladimir Putin, remains at the moment with his assets unfrozen. The UK Prime Minister in the last hour has suggested that he plans to do that. The US President Joe Biden has talked about it in the past but hasn't done it yet. And then there's also the issue of the interbank payment system, SWIFT. There is this idea that Russia could potentially be cut off from that. It would make it very difficult for Russia to receive profits, for example, from its oil and gas revenues, which account for about 40% of the country's revenue. But there are certain European countries, among them Germany and Italy, who are against preventing Russia from being involved in the SWIFT banking system. The UK Prime Minister and the US President have both said that they support that move. It just hasn't happened yet. But there is still a possibility of more sanctions from the United States themselves. We know that within the last hour or so, President Biden has spoken to the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. We're waiting for the White House's official readout of that call, but President Zelensky tweeted that the two leaders had spoken about strengthening sanctions. No suggestion of what they could be, but there is that suggestion there could be more to come. They also spoke about concrete defense assistance and an anti-war coalition. The Ukrainian leader thanking the US president, saying that he was grateful for the strong support that the US was showing. We haven't, during the course of Friday, heard of any new sanctions coming for the United States, but there are still some hours yet to run. There could be new announcements over the coming hours before the end of the day here in Washington.
Nick, obviously this is a fast developing story. It develops by the minute, by the hour. President Zelensky saying that not only is he in danger, he seems to understand that he's the #1 target of a Russian offensive in terms of the missile strikes. His family is second in line, but he said they are not in Kiev. His appeal to the Allied forces for more forceful sanctions, what does he have in mind, and what would this translate into? If you were having a conversation with President Biden, as you said, you're still waiting for the transcripts, but just judging from what President Biden has said in the past and what is within the realm of possibility for the US to offer.
Well, we know a few things that are possible. We also know a few things that are not possible. On the possible list, there is sanctioning President Putin himself. That would have a major impact on him. The European Union have frozen his assets as of about an hour ago. The US has not gone that far yet, but it could. Then there's the SWIFT banking system that I mentioned just a moment ago. Those are possibilities that the US president could activate the sanctions unilaterally against President Putin, but he would still need buy-in from other European countries to persuade the Germans, persuade the Italians to get on board with that SWIFT interbanking system, cutting the Russians off from that. But what we know the US president will not do is send military aid to Ukraine. He's been very clear about that. As Ukraine is not a NATO member, the US and other NATO members will not be sending military troops to Ukraine. They're instead strengthening their alliance around Ukraine in other NATO countries. There was this NATO meeting during the course of the last few hours. Joe Biden was involved in that. Out the back of that, they released a statement telling the Russian leader to desist with his violence, but also saying that the NATO members had decided to strengthen and add additional, they said significant, defensive deployments of force to the eastern part of the alliance, so the countries surrounding Ukraine, like Romania, like Poland. And we also know that they're activating, for the first time ever in its history, NATO's Rapid Reaction Task Force, about 5,000 troops that are standing by. They'll also have intelligence support and air defence support as well. So NATO moving ahead with those steps, but making it clear that those troops will not be heading to Ukraine itself to assist in any of the fighting that's taking place there.
Now, let's talk about the recent events. President Zelensky making an overture to the Russian president, saying, please come to the negotiation table, let's have talks. We understand that the Russian president is willing to send a delegation to sit down and talk about the Minsk agreements. Now, do we know, although President Biden has said that he supports continued diplomatic efforts, he has said Putin is the aggressor, Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. And we know the Russian president has said the stickler point to, or at least anything that will bring about peace, a cessation of hostilities, is the Ukraine committing to not being part of NATO. Do we know how the US would then advise President Zelensky on how to continue along this vein?
Well, the diplomatic path forward now is still very muddied. We know that Zelensky reached out to President Putin asking for talks. We know that the Kremlin has considered those talks. We're hearing from the spokesperson in Russia for the Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that Putin would be willing to engage in those talks. They would take place in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. However, what is unclear is what the preconditions would be. What would Russia be asking for in return for even turning up to the negotiating table? They have talked so far about regime change. That seems to be the assessment from Western countries, including the United States, the Pentagon, saying that they believe that that is what Russia's end goal is, to remove Zelensky and his government and install their own pro-Russian government. Is that something that President Putin would therefore ask for as a simple precondition for those talks to start? You mentioned NATO. We also don't know whether that could be something that the Russian leader demands off the back of these talks. We know already ahead of the invasion that that's what he wanted to happen. He was asking for a guarantee from the United States that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO. But it's unclear if that would be a definite thing that he's looking for in order for these talks to move forward. So yes, the US is saying that it wants diplomacy to happen, but it is also somewhat sceptical at this stage that the Russian president is definite in his intentions to sit down, especially when it's so unclear exactly what he wants from those talks.
I wonder, Nick, what is the conversation, especially around observers in the United States, particularly among academia, politicians, on whether or not President Joe Biden can play the role of mediator? He has clearly taken a position. He is in support of the Ukraine and its stance on this conflict. Is there any talk around that about if he can play, as it were, a helpful role in bringing about an end to the conflict?
Well, undoubtedly, President Biden would like to think that he can, but it's unclear whether he would be able to. He has a long history of foreign policy. He was heavily involved in that during his time, several decades, in the Senate. Also heavily involved when he was vice president under President Obama. He has foreign policy credentials. However, if we look at very recent history, within the course of the last year, there was the chaotic, messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. Really a huge foreign policy failure for the Biden administration. So there there is that fear that perhaps he needs to get things right on the foreign policy front now if he's going to have any credibility in the future. This is a huge test for the US president. He was aiming for diplomacy in the weeks up to the invasion. He had phone calls with Putin. He had a virtual meeting. He sent his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to meet the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov. All of that did not prevent the invasion. So it's now a question of what he could possibly do now to achieve some sort of peace. He would hope to be in the centre of things, but it would be perhaps a difficult sell to say that he will be able to come up with the goods when you consider what's happened in the US over the course of the last year.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Nick Harper, my colleague who is in Washington. And of course, later on, we'll catch up with our other colleague, Sharon Bryce Pease, who is at the United Nations, the Security Council, expected to debate on this issue.